The morning everything began, I wasn't expecting a confrontation or a revelation. I was just trying to leave my apartment quietly, holding my purse a little tighter than usual, counting the minutes before my ride arrived. Retirement had taught me how to move softly through the world, how to avoid inconvenience, how to stay out of the way. I pressed the elevator button and waited, staring at the numbers above the door like I had done 1,000 times before. That's when I heard my name, spoken carefully, almost gently, but with intention. It was my building's maintenance supervisor, a man I'd exchanged polite greetings with for years but never more than that. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight, glancing down the hallway as if making sure no one else was listening. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, lowering his voice, "but I think you should know what people say when you're not around." I laughed politely, the way women my age are trained to do, brushing it off as unnecessary concern. But he didn't smile back. Instead, he sighed and said something that stopped me cold. "They talk about you like you're already gone." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Gone how? Dead? Moved? Forgotten? He hesitated, clearly regretting opening his mouth, but once the words were out, he couldn't pull them back. He told me that during routine maintenance checks, when doors were open and voices carried, he'd overheard conversations, my adult children discussing my apartment, my belongings, even my schedule. They spoke as if I were a problem to be managed, not a person to be respected. They joked about how long I'd last on my own, about how much easier things would be once I wasn't making decisions anymore. I felt my face heat up, embarrassment mixing with disbelief. These were the same children who kissed my cheek on holidays, who called me Mom in soft voices when they needed something. The elevator arrived with a quiet ding, but neither of us moved. As he spoke, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces finally snapping into place. The rushed phone calls. The sudden interest in my finances. The way family dinners had turned into whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I had told myself it was normal. People get busy, lives change, generations drift. I had chosen peace over questions, silence over discomfort. That choice felt safe at the time. But standing there in that hallway, I realized how expensive that silence had been. I thanked the supervisor, my voice steady despite the storm forming in my chest, and stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, an older woman, yes, but still present, still thinking, still very much alive. And for the first time in years, I made a quiet promise to myself, would stop pretending not to hear what was being said. That day, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't cry or call a friend. Instead, I went home and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped with homework and birthday cakes. I opened a notebook and began writing, dates, comments, moments that suddenly made sense. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning clarity. Because when people start treating you like an inconvenience, the most powerful thing you can do is remind them, calmly, deliberately, that you are still the author of your own life. And this time, I wasn't going to wait for someone else to tell my story for me. That afternoon stretched longer than it should have. Time has a strange way of slowing down when something inside you shifts, when the ground you thought was solid suddenly feels hollow. I sat at the kitchen table long after the coffee went cold, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of traffic outside my window, and the louder noise inside my head. I replayed the maintenance supervisor's words again and again, not because I doubted them, but because they forced me to see familiar moments through an unfamiliar lens. Conversations I had brushed off as harmless suddenly felt sharp. Smiles that once seemed affectionate now carried a practiced quality, as if they were rehearsed. I realized how often I had been talked over, redirected, gently but firmly nudged away from decisions that once belonged to me. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It happened slowly, politely, wrapped in concern and disguised as help. When my children called that evening, their voices sounded normal, warm even. They asked if I was feeling well, if I needed groceries, if I remembered my doctor's appointment next week. I answered calmly, just as I always had. But this time, I listened differently. I noticed how quickly they offered solutions before I finished sentences, how easily they dismissed my opinions with phrases like, "Don't worry about that," or "We'll take care of it." Years ago, I might have felt grateful. That night, I felt invisible. After we hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. I wondered when concern had quietly replaced respect, and how I had allowed that exchange to go unnoticed. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, watching the ceiling fan turn shadows into slow-moving shapes, thinking about all the times I had chosen peace over truth. I remembered the first time my checkbook was gently taken from my hand, the first time someone suggested I rest, while decisions were made without me. Each moment had felt small, almost thoughtful. That was the danger of it. Disrespect rarely announces itself loudly. It whispers. It waits for you to doubt yourself before it settles in. Somewhere between midnight and morning, I made another decision. I wouldn't confront anyone yet. Confrontation invites denial, defensiveness, and rehearsed apologies. What I needed first was understanding, my own. Over the next few days, I paid attention. Not obsessively, not angrily, just clearly. When my daughter visited, I noticed how she glanced around my apartment, mentally rearranging it, already imagining changes I hadn't agreed to. When my son spoke about future plans, he used words like, when, instead of, if, assuming my absence as a given rather than a possibility. None of it was cruel on the surface. That was what made it harder to name. They weren't villains. They were people who had grown comfortable seeing me as a background character in a story that still belonged to me. I began quietly organizing my life in ways no one noticed. Papers were sorted. Accounts reviewed. Conversations replayed and written down, not as accusations, but as evidence. There was something grounding about putting things in order, about reclaiming the role of observer instead of subject. Each small action reminded me that I was still capable, still present, still thinking ahead. I wasn't planning a dramatic reveal or a public reckoning. I was preparing for something far more powerful, choice. One morning, as I walked through the lobby, I caught my reflection again in the glass doors. For years, I had measured myself by usefulness, by how little trouble I caused, by how easy I made things for others. Standing there, I saw someone different. Someone older, yes, but also sharper than she'd been given credit for. I thought about all the women before me who had been quietly erased while still breathing, their voices softened until they disappeared altogether. I understood then that this wasn't just about my family. It was about refusing to fade politely. When the elevator doors opened that day, no one intercepted me. No warnings, no whispered truths. Just silence. And for once, that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt temporary. Because I knew something now that I hadn't known before, the moment people decide your life is easier without your input is the moment you must remind them, calmly, deliberately, that you are still here. And soon, very soon, they would realize that assuming otherwise had been a mistake. By the end of that week, something subtle but irreversible had changed inside me. I was still polite, still soft-spoken, still careful with my words, but I was no longer unaware. Awareness has weight. Once it settles in, it changes how you stand, how you listen, how you breathe in a room where decisions are being made around you instead of with you. I began to notice patterns I had ignored for years. How plans were discussed as if I would simply adapt. How my preferences were acknowledged with a nod and then quietly overridden. How phrases like, "It's just easier this way," were used as shields, not for efficiency, but for control. None of it was dramatic enough to protest, and that was precisely why it worked. It relied on my reluctance to be difficult, my lifelong habit of smoothing edges so others could move comfortably. One afternoon, my daughter stopped by unexpectedly. She brought groceries I hadn't asked for and rearranged my pantry while chatting about her day. I watched her hands move with confidence, deciding where things belonged, explaining her choices as if she were teaching a child. I smiled, thanked her, and said nothing. But inside, I noted the way she never once asked how I preferred things, the way she spoke about my space as temporary. When she mentioned, casually, that she had looked into other living options for me, places with staff, schedules, rules, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not fear. Not anger. Resolve. She spoke as though the conclusion had already been reached, as though my consent was a detail to be handled later. I nodded again, the way I always had, and let her believe the conversation was settled. That evening, I made a phone call of my own. Quietly. Carefully. I didn't announce it, didn't hint at it, didn't use it as leverage. I asked questions. I confirmed details. I learned what my options truly were, not the ones presented to me, but the ones available to me. There is power in knowing the full picture, especially when others assume you only see fragments. With every answer I received, my confidence returned in small, steady increments. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't dependent. I had simply been underestimated. Days later, during a family dinner, the conversation drifted toward the future again. My son spoke about logistics, timing, convenience. My daughter nodded along, adding comments about safety and responsibility. They spoke kindly, reasonably, as though they were doing me a favor. I listened until there was a pause, a rare moment when no one was speaking for me. Then I said, calmly, that I wasn't going anywhere. The table went quiet. Forks paused mid-air. Someone laughed softly, assuming I was joking. I didn't correct them. I simply repeated myself, slower this time. The discomfort that followed was immediate and revealing. Concern turned into confusion. Confusion into irritation. For the first time, I saw how much they relied on my silence to keep things moving smoothly. Later that night, alone again, I felt the weight of what I had done. Standing up for yourself, especially after years of not doing so, doesn't feel triumphant at first. It feels lonely. It makes you question whether you're being unreasonable, selfish, ungrateful. I sat with those doubts, examined them, and realized they weren't mine. They were borrowed, absorbed over time from people who benefited from my compliance. Returning them felt necessary. I began to imagine what would happen when they finally realized I wasn't bluffing. Not just that I wouldn't move, but that I would decide. That I would choose what stayed, what changed, and who had access to my life. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies spoken out of panic. I wanted acknowledgement. Recognition. A shift so clear it couldn't be undone quietly later. As the days passed, I noticed a change in how they spoke to me. Questions replaced statements. Suggestions softened. It wasn't kindness, it was caution. They sensed movement beneath the surface, something they hadn't accounted for. And for the first time in years, that imbalance worked in my favor. I wasn't loud. I wasn't dramatic. I was simply present, fully and unmistakably present. What they didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that I was nearing the moment when patience would no longer be required. Not because I had run out of it, but because patience had done its job. It had given me clarity. And soon, very soon, clarity would give way to action. Quiet action. The kind that doesn't ask permission and doesn't announce itself until it's too late to stop. The shift became impossible to ignore after that dinner. It wasn't just in what was said, but in what wasn't. Messages became shorter. Visits felt measured. There was a carefulness now, an unspoken awareness that something had changed and couldn't be easily pushed back into place. I noticed it most in the pauses, those brief silences after I spoke, when they waited to see if I would retreat or soften my words. I didn't. Not out of defiance, but because I no longer felt the need to explain myself. Explanation is often mistaken for courtesy, but too often it's used to reopen doors you've already chosen to close. One morning, my daughter called with a tone that was too practiced to be casual. She suggested we sit down together and talk things through. I agreed, not because I felt pressured, but because I was ready. We met in my living room, sunlight spilling across the furniture I had chosen and paid for, the space that still held decades of my life. She spoke first, carefully listing concerns disguised as worries: my health, my memory, my safety. Each point was delivered gently, as if wrapped in cotton. I listened without interrupting, without nodding. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for reassurance. Instead, I thanked her for her concern and told her I had already taken care of those matters. The surprise on her face was brief but unmistakable. She hadn't expected preparedness. She had expected compliance. That conversation opened something neither of us could close again. Questions followed, about finances, about plans, about decisions that had once been assumed. I answered selectively. Not evasively, but intentionally. I realized I didn't owe anyone full access to my life simply because they were family. Trust is built on respect, not entitlement. And respect had been in short supply for too long. When she left, there was no resolution, but there was clarity. For both of us. In the days that followed, I felt lighter in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because conflict had been resolved, but because it was finally visible. Hidden tension drains you slowly, quietly. Exposed tension, at least, can be addressed. I began reclaiming small pleasures that had nothing to do with anyone else: morning walks without explanation, afternoons spent reading instead of waiting for calls, evenings filled with my own thoughts instead of rehearsing conversations that never happened. Each choice reminded me that my life didn't need an audience to be valid. My son tried a different approach. He arrived unannounced one afternoon, bringing concern with him like a familiar tool. He spoke about responsibility, about family duty, about how much easier things would be if I let them help. I listened again, noticing how help was always framed as something I received, never something we discussed together. When I told him I was managing just fine, his frustration slipped through the cracks. It wasn't anger, it was inconvenience. I had disrupted a plan he hadn't realized depended on my silence. After he left, I sat alone and allowed myself to feel the sadness I had postponed. Accepting truth doesn't erase grief, it rearranges it. I grieved not just the present moment, but the years I had spent minimizing myself to keep relationships intact. I grieved the version of motherhood that required me to disappear in order to be loved. And then, quietly, I let that grief pass. Because grief, when acknowledged, makes room for something else. That something else arrived in the form of certainty. I knew what I would do next, not impulsively, not dramatically, but decisively. I would set boundaries that didn't bend under emotional weight. I would document, formalize, and protect what was mine, not out of mistrust, but out of self-respect. The idea no longer scared me. It grounded me. I began organizing things not just practically, but symbolically. Papers placed where I could reach them. Decisions written down instead of left floating in conversation. Conversations ended when they turned circular. I stopped performing reassurance. I stopped apologizing for being steady. And with every small act, the balance shifted further in my favor. What my family didn't understand yet was that this wasn't a phase, and it wasn't a reaction. It was a recalibration. Years in the making, quietly building beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when awareness became undeniable. That moment had passed. And what came next would not be loud or cruel, but it would be irreversible. What followed wasn't dramatic enough for anyone to notice at first, and that suited me just fine. Change, when done quietly, unsettles people far more than confrontation ever could. I stopped responding immediately to messages that carried assumptions in them. I took my time returning calls. Not out of spite, but to re-establish rhythm, my rhythm. For years, I had been available, accommodating, predictable. Now I was simply present on my own terms, and that alone was enough to create discomfort. I scheduled appointments without announcing them. Reviewed documents without commentary. Asked questions without explaining why I needed the answers. Each step felt oddly liberating, like stretching muscles that had been dormant for too long. I noticed how often people equate transparency with obedience, how quickly curiosity turns into suspicion when you no longer volunteer details. It confirmed something I had begun to understand: access had been mistaken for entitlement. One afternoon, my daughter called again, her voice edged with something sharper than concern. She asked why I seemed distant, why I hadn't shared what I was planning. I told her I wasn't distant, I was focused. The silence on the line stretched long enough to reveal her frustration. She reminded me of everything they had done for me, every moment they had stepped in when I needed help. I acknowledged those moments without surrendering to them. Gratitude doesn't require surrender. Love doesn't demand erasure. Saying that out loud, even calmly, felt like crossing an invisible line. Later that week, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Voices lowered, plans discussed, my name used as context rather than participant. It wasn't betrayal that hurt, it was familiarity. They spoke as though they had already adjusted to my absence, as though my life was something to be reorganized once I stopped resisting. For a brief moment, I felt the old urge to step in, to correct, to reassure. Instead, I stepped back. Observing truth without interrupting it is one of the hardest things a person can do. That night, I sat at my desk and made things official. Not in a symbolic way, but in a practical one. Decisions were recorded. Instructions were clarified. Boundaries were put into language that couldn't be softened by interpretation. There was no anger in it. Only clarity. The kind that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. I slept better than I had in months. The next family gathering was different. Polite. Controlled. Everyone chose their words carefully, like stepping across thin ice. I was treated less like a responsibility and more like a variable, unpredictable, potentially disruptive. I found the shift almost amusing. Power doesn't announce itself when it arrives, it reveals itself in how others adjust. My son tried humor, then guilt, then concern, each tactic layered over the last. None of it landed the way it once had. I listened, responded briefly, and changed the subject when it no longer served me. When he asked, half joking, if I was mad at them, I told him I wasn't mad. I was awake. He didn't laugh. In quiet moments, I reflected on how easily love becomes transactional when roles go unexamined. How quickly someone's value is measured by how convenient they are. I had been useful for so long that I had mistaken usefulness for worth. Letting go of that illusion wasn't painful, it was freeing. I no longer needed to earn my place at the table. I already had one. As the days passed, I sensed anticipation building around me, like people waiting for a storm that never quite arrives. They expected confrontation, tears, accusations. What they got instead was consistency. Calm. Follow through. That unnerved them more than any argument could have. Because calm can't be dismissed as emotional. And follow through leaves no room for negotiation. What they still didn't know was how close we were to the moment when everything would become undeniable. Not because I planned to expose anything, but because truth, once secured, has a way of revealing itself naturally. I didn't need to rush it. I had already waited long enough. And when the time came, it wouldn't feel like retaliation. It would feel like balance finally being restored. The moment didn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It came quietly, almost politely, the way truths often do when they've been waiting long enough. A family meeting was suggested, framed as concern, wrapped in soft language meant to feel safe. I agreed without hesitation. By then, I understood something they didn't: this conversation wasn't for me. It was for them. We gathered in my living room again, the same space where assumptions had once passed unnoticed. This time, I felt anchored, not defensive. I listened as they spoke in turns, each repeating familiar themes: worry, responsibility, practicality. They spoke as if consensus already existed, as if my presence was ceremonial rather than necessary. When it was my turn, I didn't counter their arguments. I didn't raise my voice or list grievances. I simply stated facts. I told them I had made my arrangements. That my decisions were final. That I was not moving, not relinquishing control, and not seeking approval. The stillness that followed was immediate and absolute. No one interrupted. No one laughed. They had expected emotion. They hadn't prepared for certainty. My daughter was the first to respond, her voice tight with disbelief. She asked why I hadn't told them sooner. I answered honestly, that I needed time to understand what was happening without pressure. That I wanted to be sure of myself before inviting opinions designed to change my mind. My son accused me of shutting them out. I reminded him that boundaries are not walls, they're lines that clarify where one person ends and another begins. The words surprised even me, not because they were rehearsed, but because they were true. As the conversation unfolded, something shifted in the room. The concern that had once felt convincing now sounded performative. The frustration underneath it surfaced briefly, then retreated. I realized then how much of their confidence had been built on the belief that I would eventually yield. Watching that belief dissolve was uncomfortable, but necessary. People react strongly when roles change without their consent. After they left, the apartment felt different. Quieter, yes, but also clearer. I sat alone for a long time, absorbing the aftermath, not with regret, but with reflection. Standing up for yourself doesn't erase relationships, it transforms them. Some grow healthier. Others reveal fractures that were always there. I was prepared for either outcome. In the days that followed, communication became more deliberate. Messages were shorter, less directive. Invitations came with actual questions attached. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was recalibration. They were learning, slowly, that I was no longer an accessory to their plans. I was a participant in my own life. I thought often about how easily autonomy can be mistaken for rebellion, especially when it comes from someone who has spent years accommodating others. There is an expectation that age should soften a person into passivity, that wisdom means stepping aside. I had learned instead that wisdom sometimes means stepping forward, quietly, firmly, without apology. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late at night, when memories surfaced and old habits tugged at me, I wondered if I had been too abrupt, too distant. But each time, I returned to the same truth: clarity had replaced confusion. Peace had replaced resentment. That wasn't something to undo. One afternoon, I ran into the building supervisor again in the lobby. He smiled, asked how I was doing. I thanked him, not directly, not explicitly, but with a look that said more than words could. He nodded, as if he understood. Sometimes, a single sentence spoken at the right moment can change the course of a life. Sometimes, it's the silence that follows that allows it to settle. I knew then that whatever came next, whether acceptance or distance, understanding or resistance, I would meet it on my terms. The foundation was set. The decisions made. And for the first time in years, I felt fully present in my own story, no longer waiting for permission to live it. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, but only if you allow it to. In the weeks after that conversation, life settled into a new rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, and surprisingly honest. The constant hum of anticipation, the feeling that I needed to be ready for the next intervention or suggestion, faded. In its place came something steadier. I woke up without rehearsing explanations. I made plans without checking how they might be received. For the first time in years, my days belonged entirely to me, and that ownership felt both strange and deeply satisfying. My children adjusted in ways that were subtle but telling. Calls became less frequent but more intentional. When they visited, they asked instead of assumed. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it was respect, or at least the beginnings of it. I understood that change like this takes time, especially when it disrupts long-standing expectations. They were learning a new version of me, one that didn't fit neatly into the role they had grown comfortable with. That discomfort wasn't something I needed to fix. I spent more time with myself, rediscovering the quiet joys I had postponed for years. Long walks without purpose. Afternoons spent reading until the light shifted. Conversations with neighbors that didn't revolve around concern or obligation, but curiosity and shared laughter. I realized how much of my emotional energy had been consumed by managing other people's comfort. Letting go of that responsibility created space to think, to feel, to simply exist without justification. There were moments when grief resurfaced, unexpected and sharp. Not grief for what had happened, but for what might have been if I had spoken sooner. I allowed myself those moments without judgment. Regret, when acknowledged, becomes a teacher rather than a burden. It reminded me that self-advocacy is not selfishness delayed, it's survival postponed. And survival, I had learned, is not a solitary act, it reshapes everyone around you. One evening, my daughter stayed behind after a visit. We sat in the living room, the same space where assumptions had once been made for me. She spoke carefully, choosing words that didn't presume. She admitted that she hadn't realized how much she had taken over, how easily concern had turned into control. It wasn't an apology, not fully, but it was something close. I didn't rush to reassure her. I let the moment stand on its own. Understanding, when earned, doesn't need immediate comfort. As months passed, I noticed how differently I carried myself. Not straighter, not louder, just more certain. Certainty changes how people approach you. It alters the tone of conversations before words are even spoken. I no longer felt the need to prove my capability or defend my choices. They spoke for themselves now. I thought often about how many people live their lives shrinking in increments so small they go unnoticed. How many accept diminished roles because resistance feels impolite. My story wasn't unique in that sense. It was simply one of many, unfolding quietly in homes and families everywhere. The difference was that I had stopped mid-sentence and chosen another ending. The building felt different too, less like a temporary shelter and more like a home again. I planted new flowers on the balcony, not because someone suggested it, but because I wanted to. I rearranged furniture with no intention other than comfort. These weren't acts of defiance. They were acts of presence. I understood now that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you demonstrate by how you live. By choosing clarity over compliance. By accepting the discomfort that comes with change. And by trusting that your voice, even when it trembles, deserves to be heard. As I sat one morning with a cup of tea warming my hands, watching the city move outside my window, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, contentment without conditions. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. And honesty, I had learned, is the quietest form of freedom. The truth is, the story didn't end with a confrontation or a dramatic reversal. It ended with something far quieter, yet far more enduring, acceptance. Not the kind that comes from surrender, but the kind that grows from clarity. I no longer waited for permission to live the life I had built. I simply lived it, and that changed everything around me. The tension that once filled conversations dissolved, replaced by a cautious but genuine understanding that I was not stepping away from my family, only stepping fully into myself. Over time, boundaries stopped feeling like walls and started feeling like doors, clearly marked, deliberately placed, and opened only by mutual respect. My children began to see me not as a responsibility to manage, but as a person with agency, preferences, and limits. They still worried, of course. Love doesn't disappear when control does. But worry learned to stay in its lane, and that made all the difference. Our relationship evolved into something more adult, more balanced, and ultimately more honest than it had ever been before. I realized that the hardest lesson wasn't teaching others how to treat me, it was learning to believe that I deserved better treatment in the first place. For years, I had mistaken silence for peace and compliance for harmony. What I have now is neither loud nor dramatic, but it is real. It is a life where my voice matters because I choose to use it, not because someone allows me to. There were still moments of doubt, still echoes of the old habits that once kept me small. But each time they surfaced, I met them with a steadiness I didn't know I possessed before. Growth doesn't erase fear, it teaches you how to stand beside it without shrinking. And in doing so, it rewrites the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you're capable of. I often think about that earlier version of myself, the one who stood quietly, hoping understanding would arrive on its own. I don't judge her. She did what she thought was necessary to keep the peace. But peace that costs you yourself is too expensive. What I have now is not perfect peace, but it is authentic. And authenticity, I've learned, is worth far more. This experience changed the way I look at aging, independence, and family. Growing older doesn't mean becoming invisible or less capable. It doesn't mean handing over your decisions or shrinking your world. It means choosing, again and again, to remain present in your own life. To claim your space without apology. To redefine what strength looks like, not as endurance, but as self-respect. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this: you don't need a dramatic moment to reclaim your life. Sometimes all it takes is a quiet refusal to disappear. A calm decision to stay whole. And the courage to believe that your story still belongs to you. Now, when I look around my home, I don't see compromise etched into every corner. I see intention. I see a life shaped by choice rather than expectation. And in that clarity, I've found something deeper than validation. I've found freedom.